Before you read, be sure to ask a question on your Google slide about a path to freedom. Chapter 4. In the 1820s, a white man named John Rankin moved from the slave state of Tennessee to the free state of Ohio. He bought a house in a town on the Ohio River. Every night, John Rankin raised a lantern to the top of a pole in his front yard. Why did he keep doing this? Slaves fleeing from Tennessee had to cross the Ohio River, and John Rankin wanted to help them. The lantern showed the way to the river. The lantern was a beacon and a guide. It was also a sign that Rankin's home was a safe house. Slaves could stop there and get food, shelter, and clothing before heading off again. John Rankin became famous for helping slaves escape. Plantation owners were furious with him. Some came across the river and attacked his house. They even tried to set it on fire. But that did not stop Rankin. He continued to help runaways until slavery was finally outlawed. Around that same time, a Quaker named Levi Coffin lived in Newport, Indiana. Indiana was a free state that shared a border with Kentucky, a slave state. Even in Indiana, however, many people didn't see anything wrong with slavery. Coffin and his wife Catherine, however, hated slavery. If they could help slaves fleeing from Kentucky, of course they would. Not only did the Coffins feed and clothe the runaways, sometimes Levi Coffin took them to a house farther north. Coffin had a special wagon with a secret compartment in the bottom. This compartment could hide a slave or two. Sometimes he hid them under bales of hay or in boxes. In the early 1820s, most people like John Rankin and the Coffins worked alone. They were not part of any group. But by around 1830, abolitionists began to see themselves as part of a team. They began to work together. A new language was developed. They called their homes and other stopping places stations. They called themselves station masters, conductors, or operators. Travel routes were called lines, and they called the escaping slaves cargo or passengers on this unusual train to freedom. News of the railroad spread south. Slaves who made it to freedom in the North might become conductors. Free blacks living in the North became conductors too. All these people helped the Underground Railroad to grow. By the 1840s, there was a system in place. But because it was a secret, no records were kept. Even today, we don't know exactly how the Underground Railroad operated. We do know that networks were set up in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and the states in New England. Slaves escaping from Gulf states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama typically went north to Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Slaves from the East Coast usually went to Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, and Maine. Slaves in Texas went the opposite direction, south to Mexico. Mexico was a country where slavery was illegal. Now take a look at this map. It's called Routes to Freedom. Notice, if you lived in Arkansas, you would travel this route into Illinois or Wisconsin, maybe Indiana, through Kentucky to Ohio, all the way to this state. Slaves took many routes to freedom. Slaves who lived in North Carolina or Virginia tried to get to New York City, Philadelphia, or Boston. Those from Mississippi went to Cleveland, Detroit, or Chicago. Not all slaves went north. Slaves in Georgia might escape to the Everglades, to Cuba, Jamaica, or Haiti. Those are islands in the Atlantic south of the United States. Often, slaves picked winter around Christmas to escape. They had time off for the holiday, so it might take several days before they were missed. Also, in winter, the Ohio River would be frozen and easier to get across. Escape routes often involved crossing the Ohio River. Slaves found secret ways to let their friends know of their plans to escape. They often sang while they worked in the fields. Their overseers did not pay attention to the words of their songs. One song, called "Let My People Go," let other slaves know that the singer was about to run away. Slaves used hollowed-out gourds as water dippers, but a drinking gourd was also a code word for the Big Dipper, the constellation that points to the North Star. Runaway slaves needed to follow the North Star to escape to freedom. So following the drinking gourd was a phrase that also meant slaves were going to try to run away. So notice, here is the Big Dipper. You see it in the night sky, and where the water would pour out at the bottom points to the North Star. So if you go toward the North Star, you know you will be traveling north. Slave owners didn't like to talk about the North. They didn't want slaves to know they could find a better life there. Often, masters made up lies. They said black people were treated terribly up north, worse than on plantations. That did not keep slaves from running away. Slave owners also said it was too cold to live in Canada. One male slave said, "We knew Canada was a good country for us because master was so anxious that we not go there." On their journey to freedom, slaves took nothing with them, just themselves. They had to stay on the run, even when they did not know where their next step would lead them. Because most slaves didn't know how to read, many didn't even understand where exactly the North was or how to get there. The only thing they knew was that North meant no slavery, and that was enough. On the road, slaves looked out for lanterns or quilts hung over porches. A colorful quilt displayed outdoors might be another sign of a safe house. Because of all the time spent in hiding, it might take slaves weeks or months to travel a short distance that normally took only a few days. They had to survive on very little sleep and very little food. Worst of all was the fear. Here is how a runaway slave named Josiah Henson described it. "A fearful dread of detection ever pursued me. I would start out of my sleep in terror, my heart beating against my ribs and expecting to find dogs and slave hunters after me." Slave catchers. From Georgia all the way up to Michigan, slave catchers combed roads, docks, and city streets looking for escaped slaves. Many took along trained bloodhounds. Sometimes a slave catcher would arrest the wrong person, such as a free black man or woman. The slave catcher didn't care. He just wanted to collect a reward. Slave catchers might earn as much as $600 a year hunting down escaped slaves. That was a lot of money back then. Back to Mr. Henson. He was right to be afraid. Runaway slaves were hunted down and often captured. Bloodhounds sniffed out runaways that were still in nearby woods or swamps. For slaves that managed to get farther away, a plantation owner might hire a slave catcher. These men earned money by capturing escaped slaves and returning them to their masters. They patrolled docks and train stations looking for runaways. If caught, an escaped slave would be severely punished. When a slave named George Tinsley tried to escape, he was chased by dogs that tore off his clothes and bit him. Then he was put in a pillory, a big piece of timber with a hole for his head, and whipped. Conductors on the Underground Railroad were punished too. In 1848, Thomas Garrett Good heavenly days. Thomas Garrett was fined about $5,400 for hiding escaped slaves in Wilmington, Delaware. That was a lot of money back then. Garrett lost his home and nearly everything else, too. In 1844, a sea captain named Jonathan Walker was caught helping 8 slaves escape by boat from Pensacola, Florida. A red-hot iron was pressed into Walker's palm. He was branded with the letters SS for slave stealer. Samuel A. Smith, a white man who helped 3 slaves escape from Virginia, was sent to jail for 8 years. In the free states, anyone caught helping or harboring a runaway slave could be fined $1,000. Despite the many dangers for both passengers and conductors, as many as 2,500 slaves a year rode to freedom between 1830 and 1860. The most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad was a former slave named Harriet Tubman. She was so brave and heroic that she deserves a chapter all her own.